Good evening. Welcome to yet another exciting event in Space Week 22, hosted by Pragyan in collaboration with Nakshatra. The theme for Space Week 22 is Women in Space, and we're incredibly honored to host this discussion with a panel of four successful women who are experts in their fields. Today's event is a panel discussion on the topic: Is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 still valid in the current era of space exploration?
As soon as humans reached for the stars, some reached for the lowbirds. Spacefaring nations have come to an agreement with various policies governing space exploration activities. The Outer Space Treaty was prepared by a committee formed by the United Nations. This committee was called the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. This treaty was signed in the year 1967 and it requires all parties to use the outer space only for peaceful purposes. With recent technical advancements, many aspects of the Outer Space Treaty can be questioned. Do private organizations in the space exploration sector have to follow these treaties? And where does India stand in the enactment of space laws?
We are certain that a discussion with these experts from various fields of space exploration will help us gain some perspective on the topic. We extend our warmest welcome to our panelists. Ms. Deepika Jayakodi, who is a commercial contract officer at Airbus and holds an advanced LLM from Air and Space Law from Leiden University. She's a board member at the Dutch Space Association and has gained a lot of expertise on the subject through her experience. Next is Ms. Pooja Tolia, who is the co-founder of Stargazing Mumbai. She is pursuing her PhD in outer space politics. She is also an honorary lecturer at the Nehru Planetarium and enjoys hosting events related to astronomy.
Dr. Namrata Goswami, an author, strategist, and consultant. She holds a PhD in international relations and she has extensive experience in building framework for space policies and peace resolutions. Her book discusses the battles of political power over outer space and what the future holds for us. Ms. Sandhya Ramesh, our moderator, is an eloquent writer. Her articles focus on science and astronomy. She's a senior editor at The Print and also writes for the Planetary Society, The Wire, and The Mint. Her personal blog articles speak about the recent advancements in space research.
We will now move into the discussion. Handing it over to the moderator, Ms. Sandhya Ramesh.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this discussion. We will jump into this right away. Our introductions are done. I would still say a couple of lines about myself. It's very brief. My name is Sandhya Ramesh, and I'm the science editor at The Print India, where I cover all kinds of science, including a lot of space and astronomy. I will be moderating the discussion today between Deepika, Pooja, and Namrata. So I will just pass on the mic to each one of them for a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about their work, and then we shall jump into the discussion about the Outer Space Treaty. Can we start with you, Pooja?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sandhya, and thank you so much to all the Pragyan organizers for hosting this event. I feel that it's a very important thing to hold this discussion because the more you deliberate and talk about these things, the more nuances you bring to light. I started my journey from astronomy, and I was so passionate about it while being an art student and studying political science that I found outer space politics and decided to do my PhD in it. I am just at the final leg of it, and will be finishing this year itself. So that's it.
Hi, Deepika.
Hey, Sandhya. Thanks again to the organizers for hosting us. I think it's a great honor to be with these accomplished women here. So I work for Airbus Defence and Space in the Netherlands. I have a background in space law, and my day-to-day work focuses on establishing early stage collaborations and commercial contracts with the different players in the space ecosystem. And one of the key things that I work with is making simplified contracts that can enable us to be a more responsible and transparent business in the space ecosystem.
Thank you. Hi, Namrata.
Hi, Sandhya. What a pleasure to be here today, this evening, morning for me in the US. My background is international relations, and I studied grand strategy, including Asia. And so, for the last 20 years, I've been studying how countries view not just their space policies, but also how it fits into their grand strategic thinking. I'm an independent scholar, but I also teach space policy, international relations, and grand strategy. And just recently, my co authored book, Scramble for the Skies: The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, was put out by Lexington Press, Roman and Littlefield. It's an honor to be here and looking forward to a great interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we did get a little bit of context to what the Outer Space Treaty is, and today's discussion is its relevance in the present world and particularly in India as well. So as we heard, the Outer Space Treaty was ratified in 1967. It's a multilateral treaty which forms the backbone of international space law. It was drafted under the United Nations during the time of the Cold War, when the former Soviet Union had just sent the first artificial satellite to orbit 10 years earlier. There was the international arms race that was ongoing with the US. There was the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which led to a lot of military tension. And in general, it was an era where there was a lot of tension combining war with technology. There was the fear that outer space could be militarized, and the primary purpose of the treaty was to prevent it, to ensure that outer space is used for peaceful purposes, and to prevent any form of unrestricted exploitation of natural resources that could potentially lead to conflict on Earth. So, this was the context in which the Outer Space Treaty was set up and ratified back in 1967. It actually followed the proposal that the UN had adopted to prevent weapons of mass destruction in space. And it includes many key principles that we live by today in terms of space law and space activities, such as the use of extraterrestrial activity, like extraterrestrial territory, like that on the moon or Mars, only for peaceful or research purposes, or the right of all nations to explore space equally, irrespective of the direction that they want to go in physically, and so on. But of course, it comes with its own set of criticisms. It was drafted in a wartime era, and today's era of commercial space exploration is very different. And that is what we'll touch upon in this discussion. We'll talk about what the criticisms are, what the problems with the Outer Space Treaty is, and how we think it should be modified to better benefit effective and peaceful space exploration. So first, I wanted to start off with Deepika. So Deepika, can you tell us your opinion on the treaty? Do you think it's a useful framework today to live by? Does it function as a basic set of rules to keep countries and governments and military powers in check, specifically when it comes to, say, commercialization and militarization?
That's a great question to start off this discussion. We only have to read the full title of the Outer Space Treaty to start a debate on its relevance today. So, it is the treaty on the principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space. So, are these just principles? Is this a binding law? Yes, elements of it are considered customary international law now. So, and then we say the treaty governs the activities of states. So, what is the role of the private industry, or the private actors that are coming up now? They are to be authorized by the states, which is quite valid. We do that for every other activity on the planet where private entities are authorized by national laws. And then we have the big question on the exploration and use of space. How is this to be done? What are the do's and don'ts? And when we talk about things like, okay, the peaceful exploration and use, there's already a lot of debate around this. What constitutes a peaceful use of space? So, although the treaty is from a different generation, it has taken into account different opinions from around the world on how to conduct our, in the sense, human activities in space, while making sure that it is utilized in a safe manner. And this is evidenced in a lot of the preparatory texts that you can see that go along with the Outer Space Treaty. Sure, the treaties contain a lot of ambiguities on definitions like who is an astronaut, what is a space object, going back again to what exactly constitutes peaceful use. And then there are gaps that have come up as technology advances, things like mining resources, putting up constellations, and so on. Yet, the principles, in my opinion, the principles established in the treaties are as valid as they were a few decades ago. So, the biggest question now is that, okay, all these space actors and stakeholders in space, they constantly challenge each other to take the steps needed to enable the next stages of exploration and use. The question is, okay, how do we fill these gaps and how do we address these ambiguities rather than saying the outer space is also that needs to go out the door? Let's draft a new treaty. So this is my opinion to begin with.
Namrata, I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit from your perspective about how the international treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, is treated in general when it comes to formulating international and space policies so far? And where do you see that heading? Are when policy formulations are being done, are there more issues being raised with the treaty right now requiring modifications?
Sure, Sandhya, and thank you, Deepika, for that excellent insight. So, the Outer Space Treaty, which was signed by 110 countries and ratified by them, is a binding international treaty. So, states are not just obligated, but they have to follow the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. That's number one. So, for example, when the U.S. Launched the Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act in 2015, there was a line in the act that said that this falls under the obligation of the Outer Space Treaty. The Artemis Accord, which the US put out in 2017 for the lunar resource extraction, which Deepika was talking about, for example, mining. Even within that, it is really important that you always put your recent legislation within the context of the Outer Space Treaty. So, in that context, nations are obligated, including India, Russia, Japan, the US, China, who are all signatories and have ratified the Outer Space Treaty. So, they will have to create their international space laws in keeping in mind the principles, as Deepika was mentioning, the context, and the several articles of the Outer Space Treaty. Having said that, I'll end by saying that with especially your question in terms of the recent development, for example, the commercialization of space. So the Outer Space Treaty, when it was formed historically, the biggest concern was the US and the USSR. The US was concerned that the USSR will get to the moon before them. And so they basically, in their discussions, wanted to make sure that you have access to all areas of the moon, for example, because of the fear that the USSR might go there and basically lay claim. So we also need to remember that context. But what is interesting is that within the Outer Space Treaty, states are obligated to monitor the activities of their commercial sector. So basically, if a commercial entity in India, for example, Rebim, which is a New Space India company, if it's registered in India and launches from India, India is liable for its activities as per the Outer Space Treaty. And so it's very clear that in terms of space policy formulation, the Outer Space Treaty offers that framework in terms of how states behave.
That's very helpful. And I think that brings us to some of the criticisms. But before we go into that, I just wanted to give a little bit more context to what the core principles of the treaty are and what the main provisions of the treaty are, beyond which there are legal loopholes and problems that are being caused. And I'm just reading out from the official list here. So the first is that all exploration and use of outer space has to be for the benefit of humankind. Outer space should be free for all exploration by use of all states. It is not subject to national appropriation. You cannot claim sovereignty on any form of territory. You cannot place nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction on any territory. And
I think we just lost Sandhya.
Uh, yeah. Um,
Well, till we get her,
Until she,
yeah.
until we get her back, I think I'm just going to add in my perspective on the question she was asking earlier on the Outer Space Treaty. And I
Hi.
completely agree with both of you all. Yeah, we have Sandhya back.
I'm so sorry. I had a power cut, as you can see. Well, so may I continue?
Go ahead.
Yes. So, other than that, the core principles are that states shall not place nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, and all territories will be used for peaceful purposes. And states shall be responsible for their national space activities. They are liable for the damage that is caused in space by objects that are sent to space. And of course, the last thing in terms of planetary exploration is that all governments and entities should avoid contamination of space and celestial bodies, which comes into planetary protection. So these are the core provisions around which all of the other principles are centered and around which all of our current laws in the form that they are centered. So I was wondering, Pooja, could you maybe give us a context into some of the most common criticisms and what is probably the most common one that requires change unilaterally?
Thanks, Sandhya. So I was just talking about it while you were away for a bit. That my perspective is completely in line with Deepika and Namrata in terms of I don't think that outer space treaty is ever not going to be relevant or not valid. It's absolutely essential. But I think the question is it enough? And that's exactly one of the point of criticisms, that it's not enough. Yes, it has the first line of word when it comes to exploration, when it comes to governance of space activities. We know that there is a little bit said about, yeah, you can't really have sovereignty, no one can own things in the outer space, but the nuances of it are completely ambiguous to us. And I don't blame anyone in that sect. You can't really blame the treaty because it was written in a very different context. Like Namrata said, at that point in time, we were in a bipolar world. Today, we are not. We have a lot of developing countries as well, which are participating actively in space. We have crowded orbits. There are people, there are wars in a way waged. To get the prime slots in terms of which orbit do you want to take, so and then there is commercial space sector, and then there is the governmental exploration of space which is happening, right? Which are two different things. So again, addressing all of that through just that one treaty was going to be impossible, policy wise, which is basically the biggest criticism, that we need something more. But the problem is that now that we are in a multipolar world, to sit on a table and to come to consensus as to what should be there in the policy and what shouldn't be there is the biggest issue or the hindrance that we have. We just had the UN disarmament conference recently, and they were discussing about PPWT, which was proposed by China and Russia, a revised draft in 2014. And again, the problem throughout that we are seeing is that we are not able to find consensus on what should be included and what shouldn't be included. So I feel that the biggest criticism or the biggest problem we have is first having countries come together and find a consensus on what should we first fix.
So, would it be right to say that one of these ambiguous things that people go back and forth is the is how private companies utilize space in terms of commercialization if it is out of the government?
Yes, that is one of the things for sure. Again, like Namrata had pointed out earlier, that there is a liability that if a particular company from India has created some sort of an issue, or their satellite has created some sort of an issue in space, then India is liable to pay for the damages, not just to all the countries who will be affected by it. And again, we need to keep this in mind, that space, because it is dual in nature, right? A lot of the things which we may not even expect it to work as a weapon might end up working as a weapon. A satellite in itself can end up being a weapon itself, which is the whole challenge, which I think Deepika might be able to elaborate on, that when we talk about a space object, right, which space object, and when we say militarization of space already exists, right? But weaponization is separate from militarization when it comes to space activities, and that clarity we don't have in terms of like a governing law when we speak about it internationally.
Yes, Deepika, please, could you also elaborate a little bit more on that? And also, in terms of your experience when it comes to working with businesses, and what you think policy wise is a hindrance or would be helpful, or you see potentially in the future are modifications that would be required to the treaty that it's not fulfilling right now?
I'm going to take a contractual approach to the treaty. So in 2016, the Nobel Prize for Economics was won by people who worked on contract theory, and they were exploring in their work the fundamental shortcoming of contracts, which can also be applied to treaties. And it was that no one can predict the future, and there are too many future variables to possibly codify all of them in a contract. And that's essentially the problem that we have with the Outer Space Treaty now. And then the solution, one of the solutions that they thought about when you have these incomplete contracts or treaties that need to allow for more dynamic growth, is that these contracts or treaties, they should identify also who has the right to make these future decisions. And that's a significant kind of power. I think after I tell this, it's maybe nice to pass this on to Namrata to talk more about this as well. But essentially, the biggest issues that we see is that national interests are being pitched more and more. At least in the last few years, you see whether it's the approach towards even more militarization of space, or the commercial utilization of resources. National interests are at play. And then if these interests are put ahead of international obligations and international interests, there are bound to be conflicts. And this is where I think we need to have more international guidance. It doesn't matter if it's in the form of an international treaty signed by another 110 parties, or maybe a multilateral treaty with just more, let's say, more countries that have the most impact. But the key is trying to find out what is the principle or what is the approach that we are going to take towards addressing these gaps. Is it going to be that the loudest voice wins? How are we going to balance the interests of the different stakeholders in space right now? So it's not just public versus private. It's many different things. And I think even as the civil society, we have a relationship to space. You see more and more discussions coming up about the right of having a clear night sky. So how are we going to balance these interests in addressing the law? I think the questions that touch upon how we are going to build the political will to make this happen is more important than what needs to happen. So it has to go with a step based approach or stepwise approach.
Right. So you're essentially saying that we are at this point where nations and leaders are pushing nationalistic goals, even in terms of militarization and weaponization, which of course makes sense from their perspective, probably. And the objective is to also include the voice of the citizens so that the exploration of outer space is actually beneficial to all of humanity and not just to different member nations. Namrata, could you also elaborate a bit more on what you feel about this? And I was also wondering if you could touch upon, since Pooja mentioned weaponization of satellites, and Deepika mentioned the clear night sky. So do Starlink satellites violate the Outer Space Treaty? Or if they don't, should they, technically, considering that Now they're an impediment to science. And when China shot down its own satellite in 2007, and then when we did the same a few years ago, were we violating the treaty? Should that constitute violation of the treaty going forward?
Thank you, Sandhya. Those are complicated questions from a legal point of view. So I'll try my best to offer a bit of insight. So, if you look at the context of space, and I think it's important to put that in the discussion. So, during the Cold War, the context of space was a lot about showing off one nation's capability, technological prowess, and prestige. So, for example, if you got somewhere first, for a few days and you came back, for example, going to the moon and coming back. So it was important so that you showed yourself as a politically more attractive country. So space was very much connected to a nation's and a society's prestige on Earth so that you are more attractive as the political ideology. Today, since the end of the Cold War, the context of space has changed. So space is not just out there. Space is not something that is we are not connected to. So today, for example, the fact that we are able to talk over the internet, if we are based on satellite internet, the fact that you and I can use global positioning systems to navigate from one house to the other or one address to the other is dependent on satellite service. The fact that you can have e-commerce, e-banking, e-education is all dependent on space. And I think that is why the economic development of space has meant that concepts like the Outer Space Treaty, which was very much about geopolitics and national interests, did not anticipate that future. So the Outer Space Treaty did not anticipate a future where you would have a company like SpaceX or Blue Origin have the most advanced launch technology, for example, reusable launch capability. The Outer Space Treaty did not anticipate a future where you will have nations, for example, China. So China's lunar scientists are talking about establishing a lunar research base by 2036, which means they will have permanent installations on the moon, and which means who offers access and who gives freedom of access. So those questions were not resolved by the Outer Space Treaty. What happens when SpaceX reaches Mars, establishes a particular settlement, and then points out that they will establish their own laws because they're very far away from Earth? So those questions have not yet been navigated. Now, we do know what the Outer Space Treaty says, that states are responsible for how private entities behave, or the nation that launches or registers that particular object. But what happens if a private entity turns around and says that we do not want to be determined by these laws? And then comes the $1 million question: who enforces these laws? So, for you mentioned China's ASAT test, you mentioned India's ASAT test. So China's ASAT tests basically kill their own satellite about 800 kilometers above Earth, which means that the debris from the satellite, that was about 35,000 pieces, will continue to remain in orbit for the next decade. India's ASAT test was below 300 kilometers, and so the debris burned out by the end of that year. But yet it did create about 20 pieces of debris that still remains. But then, if you want to punish these countries, and are they liable by the Outer Space Treaty, the question is not clear, because the Outer Space Treaty does not define if anti-satellite weapon is a weapon of mass destruction, because they do not define that. Another question that comes up is that if you have, for example, state using nuclear weapons or a kind of nuclear energy to basically divert an asteroid that is coming towards Earth, what then? Right? Because on one hand, you have the obligation to save humanity. On the other hand, you're using nuclear energy in space. So those questions are still out there and have not been dealt with by the Outer Space Treaty. Now, I'll finally end by this concept of militarization and weaponization that Pooja also mentioned. And so states basically have come to the conclusion that militarization of space, which means using space for military command and control, precision navigation, are all legal. And that's why you have the US, you have China, you have now Japan, you have France, the European Union, NATO has declared space an operational domain. And so it's already decided that space can be used for military communication, support, and the question about rendezvous and proximity operations, where you have one satellite coming very close to another satellite, even that doesn't seem to be, basically, the Outer Space Treaty does not clarify if that is allowed or not. The Outer Space Treaty does clarify that you cannot put nuclear weapons in space, but then it does not ban conventional weapons. So that I'll end with that and look forward to Pooja and Deepika's insight here. Thank you.
The So the last part that you mentioned, that it does not ban conventional weapons but just nuclear weapons, was that was one of the things that happened with China's ASAT test, because they shot down the satellite with a ballistic missile, and the missile was not considered to be either nuclear or a weapon of mass destruction. And in terms of just private players as well that you had mentioned, there are companies like, I believe, Lunarland, who have offered plots on the moon. And the justification they give is that you're not allowed, companies are not covered by the treaty. It says that you cannot lay sovereignty claims, and that governments cannot acquire territory in space, but private individuals can, which seems like a very blatantly open loophole that needs to be fixed right away. So one of the things I wanted to understand is, when we realize now that there are all of these loopholes, I mean, I don't know a more appropriate word for it, that people can get around with, or are at least attempting to, even when they did, for example, with the Bogota Declaration in '76, where countries tried to claim ownership of a part of the orbit, saying that the orbit was just above their land, so geostationary satellites are their territory, the area. So when it comes to just very blatantly open loopholes like this, is there a reason why those things have not been fixed so far and have not been taken into consideration in revisions to the treaty? I was wondering maybe if, well, Pooja could start off actually.
Yeah, thanks, Sandhya. And that was extremely insightful, Namrata and Deepika, both of you. I just want to add to that and then address your question, Sandhya. So, one of the things that we had a conference for the 50-year celebration of the Outer Space Treaty, and we had Peter Marinetz, who was working in UN Corpus, and he made the statement saying that one of the things that we really need to add to the Outer Space Treaty now is like see things from three perspectives, the three S's, which is safety, security, and sustainability. All right. So if you tie down to all the other criticisms that we have of OSD or what we need to fix, I think we can kind of label it down to all these three issues, which is there basically the safety, the security, and sustainability. Like Namrata was talking about, how close can another satellite come to another satellite, so on and so forth. There is, and the commercial aspect of it, and how we have growing players in space. See, the satellite might just vanish from the commercial industry's balance sheet, but it's not going to go away from space, right? It's still going to be there as a debris. This issue of space debris, for example, is not really addressed in our Outer Space Treaty. We did try to address it, or they have tried to address it in the PPWT, but not very successfully, because they say, okay, if someone is using that as a weapon, because if you do have a system to, eradicate an entire satellite, then someone can use that as a weapon as well. So then that is a threat. So how do you let that happen then? So even the one trial that we had in terms of like a PPWT to try and address it was not very successful. The reason why I feel, coming to your question, why we've not had something actively come up, is basically, I would say this is a very, my answer is going to be more politically backed. space, like Namrata said, has become a part of looking at it from a prestige angle. So more and more people want to prove themselves. Even our Mangalyaan mission, for example, have very clearly stated as a technology demonstration, yeah, which is basically trying to show that I have the capability to do this. Now, if the earlier superpower had already proved themselves and said that you are the superpower by going to the moon. So if someone else wants to say that I am also a power, they are going to want to show off and say that I can do this too. At least do that much as the earlier superpower did, right? Now, it's just a political battle that everyone wants to show that, and because of that, there are national interests that are clashing. When you have that happening, there is no consensus. Like, we do have UN corpus and we do have dialogues happening time and again, but unfortunately everyone is very fixed on their own agenda. Even the just recent UN disarmament conference that happened, I remember one of the panelists really almost saying it out loud that, do you think we are romanticizing certain treaties? Like certain aspects of things. Like, should we be, can we move on from that and look further? Can we have a dialogue where we have the commercial sector, the policy, and the politicians sitting together to resolve this? I think only then do we have a chance of actually materializing something, because in terms of what needs to be fixed, everyone openly knows that these are the loopholes, these are the things that we need to be fixed. We perhaps can come up with we do have some technological solutions as well, but then how do we place it, and the political will to let that happen is something that, like Deepika said, the political will is going to be the most important factor there. Yes, Sandhya, you can carry on.
Yes. So, Deepika, you had also mentioned about in terms of not just political will, but also when, say, technology comes into picture. So, would you? Am I audible? Okay.
Yeah, go on.
So would you say that modifications to the treaty and any form of updation to space law would probably follow the technology? Because, say, if we look at commercial space activities like asteroid mining, we don't have the viable technology today to go to an asteroid and, first of all, mine, and then, secondly, to bring it back to Earth. So, is it a situation we're in right now where we're trying to formulate the laws beforehand to before this field even takes off? Or do you think the laws will follow only when we start having the technology and the scenario starts becoming realistic to where we need laws to figure out how to go about it?
I think the simple answer to your question is yes and no. So, in some instances, it seems like the law has to catch up with the technology, whereas on the other side, I think the Outer Space Treaty in itself has been accommodative of a lot of technology developments so far. And what you see happening more and more is actions within the different stakeholders. Like I said, the different space actors, they challenge each other because it's in their interest that space is still safe, secure, and sustainable. Because let's say from an industry perspective, you need to have these three S's in order for your business to succeed. And every stakeholder has one such interest. So I wouldn't say, going back to your earlier question as well, I don't think there's inaction on most of these issues that have been raised. It's rather okay. How fast or how slow are we with making taking the right steps? For example, when you talk about within the industry, what are satellite operators, for example, doing to reduce the risk of space debris, on orbit collisions, or even having unsustainable space operations? This was debated for a few decades now already. And then you saw that sometime last year, or maybe early this year, it was a voluntary action from these different stakeholders to come up with something called a space sustainability rating. So they are trying to incorporate elements from other industries to say, okay, this is going to be a voluntary action. We are not going to wait until laws are formalized and they are accepted for everything, but this is something that we can do from bottom up as well. And you see more of this happening. And I imagine that when it comes to addressing other loopholes, it could be an instance where we say such action can complement the top-down approaches as well. And a few of the other loopholes that you mentioned, I think it's also a problem with misinterpretation or just wrong interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. Like people selling these lunar plots and things. Sure, it's a novelty, but there's nothing valid beyond that. Or Elon Musk even saying, I think he made a statement that he's going to have his own laws when he goes to Mars. Maybe he can even get away with arranging that in his contract with his employees or robots or whatever. But then his company and he himself, they are still bound by national laws. So as long as the states and the biggest actors, they are compliant with these principles, there shouldn't be a problem with these things. As Pooja also said, we do know where the gaps are. They will be filled up, and I think in some cases it's good to speed things up. We are often putting a lot of focus on utilization of space resources. We immediately jump to space mining. And we are addressing a group of engineers here, and they can tell you how difficult it is probably to extract resources from an asteroid or even sustain, let's say, 20 people in a space station. We are jumping ahead. The biggest problem now is space traffic management. So I think it's about putting the right narratives, refocusing our resources, whether it's just the intellectual capacities or the technological capacities, on the immediate problems first, try to fill those gaps, and then proceed in steps to the next.
Namrata, would you have anything to add to that as well? And would you also address some of the immediate issues that need addressing in the Outer Space Treaty going forward?
Sure, Sandhya, and thank you, Pooja and Deepika, for your insights. As I was listening to you, I was thinking as to how much this particular conversation has given us food for thought. So, in terms of looking at what could be the loopholes, I think as Deepika was mentioning, one of the important mapping that still needs to be done is space situational awareness, right? So we do not have a similar body that we have for overflight, where you have the international, the aeronautical union which gives you flight paths. So we do not have a similar body for satellites, for example. And I think this addresses the earlier question in terms of, is Starlink violating the Outer Space Treaty? No, it's not violating the Outer Space Treaty. And I think SpaceX has, into the question of whether we'll have a dark night sky for astronomy, I think SpaceX has reached out to Astronomical Congress that they would blacken their satellites. But that still does not resolve the question, but it does not violate the Outer Space Treaty. And so coming to some of what can be done. So we do know what the loopholes are. We do know that Outer Space Treaty has not anticipated a future where you have thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, or cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the Moon that nations are focusing on, China, for example, the US. And so the one thing that can be done is to have a consensus on building a space situational awareness map, for example, where the satellites are, offer that information openly and share it, and also have communication. So I'll give you an example where this particular importance came out. So in 2019, a SpaceX satellite came very close to a European Space Agency satellite. The US Space Force, which offers us space situational awareness, warned both companies that this is going to happen. ESA tried to reach out to SpaceX, but there was a communication problem. And so SpaceX never got to know. And on its own decided to maneuver its satellite. Now, what does that mean? It means that it had to use fuel to maneuver, which is very expensive. And so companies now think that, okay, who will maneuver? It's all out there. There is no clear guideline, right, in terms of space situational awareness. So I think those, and that comes to the concept of space traffic management. Now, why is there no consensus on this matter? I mean, all nations agree that this is a very critical component. All commercial entities agree that space needs to be regulated much better. In fact, you'll be surprised that when there were hearings on the Outer Space Treaty in the US in the Senate, it was the commercial sector that basically pointed out that they will want the Outer Space Treaty to continue and importantly, basically have additional protocol. Now, why is it difficult to come to a consensus? I think the Outer Space Treaty worked because it was so ambiguous, because the concepts were it could be interpreted as per states' national legislation, right? So basically, the Outer Space Treaty tells you that space, in terms of regulatory framing, nations are responsible, right? So you have your own national legislation. So India is actually behind on that. For example, in national regulatory framework, doesn't have a clear policy in terms of its commercial sector. And so in that context, I think what is concerning is that if you look at the US Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act, it clearly tells you that if an American company or an American citizen gets to a particular celestial body first and is able to extract resources based on its investment, they get to keep those resources. So they get into the conflicted question of property. Now, China, when I visited China and spoke to some of their very senior space lawyers, especially Liu Shopping, he pointed out that China is also going to come with a national legislation very similar to the US Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act. A country in Europe, Luxembourg, has its own legislation for mining and has a very similar context. So, what is clear here is that a company or a nation that has the technology to get somewhere first, and which is going to come in the next 15 years, China's timeline is 2029 to 2034 in terms of asteroid mining, and they're investing in the 3D printing, extraction capability demonstration. I think the laws need to catch up, in my perspective. I think technology will happen. It will be very similar to what happened with the internet. No, but none of us believe that we'll have a cell phone that will carry around. And we basically laughed at people who told us that we will have GPS in the 1960s by 2000. Look at us here, right? And we don't have laws and clear ideas about internet and who is responsible for any problem. So I think that's the future we face. And the Outer Space Treaty might not get revised because you might not get consensus. Because I'll finally end with what Pooja said, and I think that's a very important point, that nations prioritize security over safety today when it comes to space. Space is seen as a very critical domain in terms of self-defense. And because of that, consensus on specific definitions might get very difficult. So you might need non-governmental pressure at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Namrata. We are almost out of time. So before I just give a concluding summary, I was wondering if Deepika or Pooja, would you have any more concluding thoughts to add to what Namrata just said?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add one thing. Whatever Deepika and Namrata have been saying have been just spot on. The one thing that I do remember in terms of like something that we need to really address when it comes to arms and arms control, the clarity that it does not exist right now in the treaty is the fact that it talks about space to ground weapons and how that is absolutely a no-no. But from ground to space, no clarity. From in space to another space, thing, no clarity. So space to space and ground to space is something we have absolutely no clarity on when it comes to outer space treaty. Space to ground, we know for sure that it's a no-no, which is the reason why an anti-satellite weaponry test is in a sense not illegal in any way, because it's ground to space. And this is also one of the criticisms to the PPWT, which is the current draft which everyone talks about, is that they also do not address the factor of ground to space weapons, because then technically even China will have a problem who is a part of drafting that. So that is also from a political or a security point of view, I think that is the one major concern that, or immediate concern that we would want to look at when it comes to outer space treaty. Yeah.
Would you like to add anything, Deepika?
Yes, not on the content of what we've discussed itself, but more on the purpose of having this discussion. And just as a pre-concluding remark, if I may, Sandhya. So I think beyond the cool and fascinating factor of space, we all have a special relationship with space. So it can be geopolitical, social, cultural, and it's important that we don't treat the discussions on outer space treaty or politics as something that's just within the domain of, say, regulators, policymakers, and lawyers. It's great that this was a discussion organized by a technology university, and I think the inputs from an industry perspective, I learn a lot from the engineers that I work with, and sometimes to space law principles and things, they would be like, "But this makes no sense. You could do it instead like this." So when you're talking about space mining laws, how you can establish safe zones on the moon and Mars and so on, I think it's important that no matter what your field is, that you get into the discussion of these topics, and that you can somehow contribute to making better space laws or regulations or policies for that matter.
Thank you so much, Deepika. And thank you, Pooja and Namrata, also for your extremely insightful comments. We are now out of time. And I do hope that for everyone who's watching, this discussion was engaging and informative enough and provided enough of a context to what the upcoming bubble of space exploration and space commercialization is governed by, how the space industry is going to expand, what we'll see over the next few years as countries advance with their technology and space starts becoming more of a playground for not just commercial players, but also individual billionaires. There are some things that we need to do to ensure that space is truly beneficial to all of humanity because of the wealth of knowledge and advancements that come from it. So I do hope this discussion was useful and insightful. Thank you so much to our panelists, Pooja, Deepika, and Namrata. And also thank you to everyone at Team Pragyan and Sudarshan and the entire team, CFGL as well. On to you guys.
Those were some beautiful insights we got from the discussion. As Ron Geran said, Earth is a small town with many neighborhoods in a very big universe. With advancements in space technologies and the natural human curiosity to explore more, we keep driving forward to achieve more. It is our responsibility as global citizens to ensure that this thirst for knowledge and curiosity doesn't turn into greed and thirst for power. This can be done through the use of law that will benefit all the countries equally.
We extend our warmest gratitude to the panelists, Ms. Deepika Jayakodi, Ms. Pooja Tolia, Dr. Namrata Goswami, and Ms. Sandhya Ramesh for gracing us with your presence. We thank our audience and the respective teams for coordinating in the smooth functioning of this event. This discussion has given us a lot of takeaway messages and definitely a lot to think about. Thank you and stay safe.